You've probably noticed something curious about human beings. The moment you point out that they're wrong, even gently, something stiffens inside them. The room changes, their eyes narrow just a little, and suddenly the conversation is no longer about truth at all. Perhaps you've been there. You saw the mistake clearly. You knew the better way, and yet you hesitated. Because experience has taught you that correcting people doesn't lead to understanding. It leads to resistance, to tension, to that subtle, exhausting game where no one is listening anymore, only defending. And then there's the other side of it, that quiet frustration you feel afterward when you think, I should have said something, or why does this always happen to me? What you're noticing is not a personal problem at all. It's simply the way the ego behaves when it feels exposed. Because the ego does not care whether something is true. It cares whether it survives. And the moment it feels threatened, intelligence goes offline. So the question is not, how do I prove I'm right? The real question is far more subtle, far more powerful. How do you speak in a way that doesn't wake the ego at all? How do you move people without pushing them? How do you win without ever appearing to compete? It's an odd situation. And so one finds oneself caught in a peculiar bind, remain silent and feel dishonest, or speak and watch the whole thing turn into a battle. If you look closely, you will notice that what we call the ego behaves very much like a security system. It isn't designed to discover what is true, it's designed to prevent embarrassment, loss of face, and the unsettling feeling of being wrong. The ego listens only selectively. Anything that confirms it is welcomed as intelligence. Anything that contradicts it is experienced not as information, but as danger. And this is why correction produces such strange results. The moment you say, that's not quite right, the mind stops hearing words and starts scanning for threats. You see, the ego is not an object you possess. It's an activity, a continual effort to maintain a certain image. I know, I understand, I am competent. So when that image is touched, the response is immediate. Defensiveness appears, justification rushes in. And what could have been a simple exchange of ideas hardens into a kind of psychological standoff. At that point, truth becomes irrelevant, because no one is listening anymore. They are simply guarding the doorway. And once you see this, you begin to understand why so many conversations go nowhere. Not because people are stupid, but because the wrong door has been knocked on. This is why correction so often fails, even when it is accurate, reasonable, and well-intended. It takes place at the level of ideas, while the resistance occurs at the level of identity. You are offering information, but what is heard is a challenge to the self, and identity is far more sensitive than intellect. To question a belief is one thing. To question the person who holds it is felt as something altogether different. It carries with it the faint suggestion of humiliation, of being seen as foolish, careless, or inadequate. So the mind responds not by reconsidering, but by armoring itself. Explanations multiply. Tone hardens. Certainty becomes louder, not clearer. And the more insistently one tries to straighten the matter, the more rigid it becomes, rather like attempting to smooth water with a stick. At this stage, logic is no longer persuasive, because persuasion was never the issue. What's at stake is the preservation of a role, the one who knows, the one who is right, the one who cannot afford to lose standing. And this is why even the clearest truth, delivered at the wrong moment, can produce precisely the opposite effect. The strange result is that disagreement increases, not because the argument is weak, but because it has touched something too close to the center. When identity is involved, understanding is postponed indefinitely. And so one begins to see that the problem is not what is being said, but where it is landing. The message may be correct, but it has arrived at the wrong address. And so the question quietly is not, how do I make them see? But rather, what is it that actually changes anything at all? Because if agreement were the measure of understanding, very little would ever move. People often agree politely and change nothing. And just as often they disagree loudly, while reality continues on its own course. What actually alters the situation is not the moment someone nods in approval, but the moment something begins to move, sometimes almost imperceptibly. A pause, a doubt, a hesitation that wasn't there before. You see, most transformation does not announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a declaration of being convinced. It appears later in a different decision, a different tone, a subtle shift in behavior. And this is why the insistence on being acknowledged as correct is such a poor indicator of anything meaningful. It satisfies the ego, perhaps, but it rarely touches the deeper current where change actually happened. From this point of view, the need to win an argument begins to look rather odd, because life doesn't respond to explanations in the abstract. People don't change because an argument was tidy or convincing. They change when they run into something, a situation, a consequence, a moment of realization that cannot be talked around. Very often, understanding arrives later, after the conversation has ended, after one has tried things out and discovered for oneself what holds and what doesn't. And when this is noticed, the impulse to correct loses its grip. Not because one is holding back, but because it becomes clear that words alone were never carrying the weight. There is then less interest in securing agreement on the spot, and more attention paid to what actually happens next. Does the situation shift? Does behavior adjust? Does something quietly resolve itself without anyone needing to admit they were wrong? And in watching this, conversation becomes lighter. One speaks when something genuinely needs to be said, and remains silent when experience itself is doing the teaching. There is less friction, less repetition, and a curious discovery that understanding often appears precisely when no one is trying to force it. If you watch these situations carefully, you begin to see that thinking only happens when a person feels safe enough to think. The moment someone feels threatened, even subtly thought contracts. It becomes repetitive, defensive, circular. This is why agreement, or at least the appearance of it, often precedes any real understanding. Not because agreement is necessary, but because it signals safety. When you align yourself first, when you show that you are not standing opposite, the tension eases. The other person no longer feels required to hold their position so tightly. Pacing matters here. If the conversation moves too quickly, anxiety rises. When it slows down, the urgency to defend diminishes. You can hear this in tone. You can feel it in the pauses. Calm repetition has a similar effect. Not repeating to insist, but repeating to show that one has heard. This alone often does more than adding new information. There is another thing that becomes clear once this sense of safety is present. When people are not being corrected, they often correct themselves. This is why questions can be so effective, not as a technique, but as a way of allowing thought to finish its own movement. A question does not arrive as a statement. It does not claim authority. It simply opens a space. And in that space, the mind begins to examine itself. You may have noticed how this works. When someone is asked to explain their view slowly, without interruption, they often hear the difficulty in it themselves. The moment of realization does not come because someone pointed it out, but because the person encountered it directly. Silence helps in the same way. When a thought is not immediately answered or opposed, it continues unfolding. It has time to show where it leads. This is very different from being refuted. There is no loss of face. No one is being pushed into a corner. What changes is not the person, but the situation they are seeing. Reality, given enough room, has a way of doing the correcting on its own. And because the insight arises from within, it is not resisted. It is accepted easily, not as defeat, but as discovery. This is why understanding that arrives by itself lasts far longer than understanding that has been imposed from outside. When the mind is allowed to move freely, it tends toward coherence. And one begins to see that the most effective correction is often the one that no one had to make. But there are moments when silence is no longer appropriate. A situation arises in which something must be said. And when that happens, the crucial thing is not to turn speech into blame. The moment blame enters, the ego returns at once. It hears accusation, and the conversation hardens. Instead, one simply states what is so, what can be done, what cannot, where one stands. There is no need to explain the other person to themselves. No need to describe their motives or errors. Only a clear acknowledgement of limits and direction. Spoken in this way, words do not provoke argument. They leave very little to fight against. They are not claims of superiority. They are not demands for agreement. They are descriptions of reality as it is being lived. And reality, when presented calmly, does not insult. It does not challenge identity. It merely sets the conditions under which things continue. The other person may disagree, they may resist inwardly, but there is nothing to defend against, because no one is being attacked. And often this clarity achieves what explanation and correction never could, not by persuading, but by allowing the situation itself to speak through you. Speech, then, ceases to be a weapon and becomes something far simpler, a quiet indication of where things stand, leaving the rest to unfold on its own. At a certain point, you will sense that the conversation has reached its limit. You have spoken clearly, you have listened, and yet the situation remains knotted. At that point, continuing to speak rarely helps, because words, once spoken, cannot be recalled. They move on, they echo, and in moments of tension, they tend to harden the very thing one hopes to loosen. This is why withdrawal, at such moments, is not a failure. It is a form of intelligence. When the atmosphere becomes charged, when urgency and defensiveness fill the space, the wisest move is often to stop adding to it. Silence, then, is not avoidance. It is a pause that allows the situation to cool. Time has a peculiar capacity to do what argument cannot. Given a little space, people think again. They hear themselves differently. They notice what was missed. But this only happens when the pressure is removed. To step back is not to abandon the matter. It is to refuse to say something that cannot be taken back. And so one waits. Not passively, but attentively. For clarity does not arrive under strain. It comes later, when the urgency has faded and the mind is no longer defending itself. In this way, silence becomes a way of keeping the situation intact until it is ready to move on its own. And very often, that is the most effective thing one can do. You see, what this has really been about is not communication at all, but the ego. Once this game is seen, life begins to feel very different. You stop taking resistance so personally. You stop mistaking defensiveness for truth. You stop trying to push against what is only trying to protect itself. And this changes everything. Because the ego is most powerful when it is taken seriously, when its alarms are obeyed without question. But when it is understood, it loses its urgency. It can be allowed to operate without running the whole situation. This is not a matter of defeating the ego. That would simply be another move in the game. It is a matter of recognizing it for what it is. A useful, limited mechanism that was never meant to be in charge. And when this recognition becomes natural, one begins to move through life with far less friction. Relationships soften, conflicts lose their sting, decisions become clearer. Not because others have changed, but because you are no longer fighting the wrong battle. To understand the ego is to stop being hypnotized by it. And that understanding is what allows one to move through the world with greater ease, greater clarity, and a surprising amount of freedom.